Καλησπέρα σε αυτή την ιδιαίτερα ενδιαφέρουσα συνεδρία. Θα μιλήσω στα αγγλικά, απλά επειδή νομίζω ότι ο μιλητής είναι πιο fluent στα αγγλικά. Okay, in this session, our invited speaker is Constantino Sakellarides, a very distinguished scholar and expert with influential work on European health policy and public health. Professor Sakellarides is a professor of health policy at the School of Public Health at the University of Lisbon, while he has also served in various prestigious positions in public health and health policy. Among others, he has been director of health policy and services at the WHO Regional Office for Europe, and also a past president of the European Public Health Association. His work has focused on a wide range of topics, including health policy and governance, and also the impact of the recent financial crisis on health and the health system. But in this particular session, Professor Sakellarides will elaborate on some lessons learned from the pandemic. So thank you very much for your participation, and the microphone actually is yours.
Well, thank you very much for your kind presentation, Mr. Ηλίας Κυριόπουλος. My greetings to all my friends in Athens from Lisbon. This presentation, in fact, will be very much focused on what we learn from pandemics. And I will start with taking back 100 years ago, when we had the infamous Spanish flu. And we can observe from this slide that not only people used masks, very elegant masks, but very popular ones too, but also public health professors would call our attention then for the necessity of physical distancing and also for being careful with our hands. And the interesting observation here is that we have a lot of historical reports about this pandemic. We do have a lot of epidemiologic studies about this pandemic, but there's very little social memory of these three facts: social distancing, mask, and hands. They didn't come to our times in any way. If you now look to a different event that took place at the beginning of the century, the avian flu, and especially the SARS epidemic, we see something with some similarities. If we look at what happens, there was a widespread epidemic in Asia, and this epidemic in Asia left some interesting social memory. This has been described in many different ways. This is one description quite recently that shows that there was increased concern about the environmental hygiene, social distance, become consciences, then we recognize the importance of communicating about issues of common interest, and then trust and cooperation was important to maintain and to enhance independent of government initiatives. Now, this didn't happen in Europe. In Europe, what predominated from the experience in what is known today is a sort of false alert. False alert can be very damaging, not only in terms of social learning, but also in terms of preparedness for pandemic. And based on these events, some time ago, a few years after SARS, we decided to reflect a bit about what we can learn from pandemic preparedness. And we reached sort of 5 conclusions from this reflection. The first one is that, fine, it's important to understand how virus spreads, but also important to understand cities, how they function, organizations, how they operate, communities, how they do relate, individuals, how they do decide. So in fact, in a smart city, interactive intelligence replaces command and control models. And especially we are concerned about tapping citizen ingenuity. Now, the third, let's say, conclusion was that it's a key element that many decentralized points of society are playing together, are working together, are networking together on the basis of two basic principles: common purpose and a common knowledge base. And also that in a smart city paradigm, people do develop a sense of control because they are active, because they work with each other, because they understand what's going on, which replaces the feelings of fear or uncertainty. Now, the final conclusion is that we can probably design a summary that says the following. Public health has two dimensions. First dimension that we use when we are facing an acute situation is what we can call public health emergency. It's centralized, it's normative, it's mandatory, it's for all, and calls for obedience. Now, a complementary approach to this is what we can call the smart community approach, that is decentralized, is informed, is differentiated, is participatory, and instead for obedience calls for collaborative intelligence. Now, following this, we study in some detail what happens in our 2009 pandemic. I'm not going into detail now. I would just summarize the more important elements. Is that when this started, the first phase, of course, there was some community activation, some active preparedness that follows quite quickly with a sense of fatigue. And when you were in this phase of fatigue, we learn that something, what's happening in southern hemisphere with the flu, especially from data from Australia. And what we heard from Australia, what we learned from them, is that this is not really a pandemic. There was a low incidence event, similar to seasonal flu, mostly with mild cases, and a very limited severe pneumonia cases. While we trying to digest this information, of course, we're also reminded that, well, this is how it is, but we may have a virus mutation. What happens as it happens in 1919, and unlike what happens in 557 and 68. But the issue now became that having used basically a normative approach, an authoritarian approach to this epidemic, and not developing the community side of it, we had difficulties of rolling down the preparation and redesign our expectations. And since we're not able to have the sort of community networking that allow us to redesign expectations, what happens after that is that the low incidence of this epidemic was in a way equated as a false alarm. There was low adherence to vaccination and conspiracy theories about the role of the big pharmaceutical industry in medication and vaccines. And therefore, basically, there was very poor social learning from this event. Now, let's come to current days and look at the COVID-19. And here we did some progress in the way that finally we start having strategies that differentiate locally, that understand that national data are averages, are abstractions, they not report the real events in the field. So this local differentiation, in a way, is in line with what an epidemic is. It's a local occurrence that expands in time and space dimensions. And on the basis of being able to differentiate locally, of course, we understand what was said some years ago, that in fact, the countries prepare when each region, each municipality, and its communities prepare. And then, as I said before, by being active locally, being active is a tranquilizing effect. And that's also an important situation to respond to a pandemic. But of course, this differentiation approach, local differentiation approach, happened in some places quite soon and some others quite late and in a incomplete way. One of the pioneer countries was New Zealand, that adopted this quite early in this pandemic. It adopted a four-level risk approach with very detailed pre-arranged, pre-established responses for each level. Did communicate quite extensively and publicly the location of the different clusters of disease in the country, which help people to understand what's going on in their communities, and they become active on the basis of this knowledge. We have information similar in France, in England also, but also quite late in this pandemic. This happens in many other places. This is in Massachusetts, in the United States. Interesting, in a city in Canada, the city of Toronto, that this risk approach was applied in neighborhoods in the city. And in Portugal also, but quite late, as you see, the 21st of November, a few weeks ago, we adopted also this local differentiation approach based on risks. But of course, the issue is, the reason I'm saying this approach has been incomplete is it is too much dependent on information on incidents and very little information on what we actually need to know to understand what's going on in our community environment. We need to know about transmission patterns, testing volume patterns and positivity, and follow on as you see in this slide. So although we made progress in trying to differentiate locally our response to the pandemic, we did that in a rather late and incomplete fashion. And as a result of that, during the lower phase of the epidemic curve, it was clear among us and in many other countries that the more traditional emergency public health paradigm, centralized and mandatory, was the one that predominated in the way we did things. Now, more recently, having in mind this reality, we tried to again to reflect on this issue, to call attention to the need to complement these two approaches, to make them one after the other, one adapted to the acute phase and one adapted to the less acute phase of the pandemic, and calling attention that if we don't do that, if we don't implement a community approach when it's appropriate, then we don't expect a significant social learning this way. And the question, of course, arises here is, why? What are the difficulties in managing this important and worrisome situation in adopting more effective social learning? And we can say that if you prolong too much this paradigm, if it takes too much time in the same way, then we end up with what we can call a disease city. And disease city is a city that has fatigue and social disruption, polarizes, is unequal, has important economic impacts, and especially is one that we look for people to be blamed about what's happened. So the cooperation, positive construction of common responses are substituted by looking suspicious to each other and trying to find who did the wrong things. Now, let me very quickly outline in a very rapid fashion what seem to be the main obstacles to evolve to a solution that has a stronger community base. First of all, is what we can call poor governance and centralized bureaucracies. Governments that believe that they can really manage change and can manage complex situation through centralized bureaucracies, whether there are central or regional bureaucracies. The second aspect has to do with what we can call television critical conservatism. So in a way, televisions have a very critical role, but the critical role is played in a way that fosters not change, but conserving the current ways of doing things. And the fourth element is about the polarizing effect of social media. By polarizing ourselves through the works of present social media, we are less able to come together in a collective intelligence that is a prerequirement to have an active community. And finally, most important, the low social capital that some of countries like Portugal and Greece, for example, have. That if you look at the social capital index that in a way deals with trust and initiative capacity, you see that the Nordics have 1.8, Ireland much less, Spain has half of Ireland, and Portugal and Greece have half of Spain. So very little social capital. If you look more recent data about trust, one of the elements of social capital, what we see is that the Danes, 74% of Danes state that they trust each other, half of them in Germany, half of German in Greece, and a bit less in Portugal. So if you have low social capital, it's difficult to sustain community action and make that as an important element of progress. Back to the notion of smart community, it can be characterized as a number of key concepts, a number of important principles, actions that result from the community activation and work, including an important effect of person-centered healthcare and person-centered health services. Now, community activation is not enough to promote change and to learn. You need to involve science. You need to learn in a systematic way from these experiences. And is not only being able to learn in a scientific way, but also provide scientific advice to the ones that decide. And let me, in this regard, take as an example SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group of Emergencies in the UK. Very elaborately, you see there's a number of working groups that work with SAGE. But through this epidemic, there was some interesting criticism to SAGE in UK, in England. And there were three kinds of criticism. The first one is that leadership was not independent from government. The second one is membership did not enough people that have a general understanding of social change occurs. And finally, it didn't communicate with the public. As a consequence of that, some colleagues of us in UK decided to create the independent stage. Independent stage is made of a number of technical and academic people. You can see Martin McKee, as many of you know, that is one of the active elements of independent stage. And what independent stage does a number of things. One thing it does is that every Friday at 1:30 p.m., they broadcast to the public and try to, in a way that public can understand, activated them by transmitting detailed knowledge of what they need to know to be active members of the community about the pandemic. Now, tonight, you can see a similar phenomenon. The famous Anthony Fauci talks on initiative of the Harvard School of Public Health, and tonight's session is called Chasing Science to Save Lives. Now, there is an interesting thing, is a recent publication about how we can think about scientific counseling, how we can think about translated science to public policy. And let me just add now a final element to this picture, saying although that community can be a social learning accelerator, although we can scientific support to public policies, we need a further element to be able to promote change to this paradigm. And this element is strategic thinking, analysis, and planning. Our public administration as a front line where most of our resources are placed that responds to immediate pressure, to today's problem, to current challenges, but doesn't have a second line of people that think of the future of the country, They think the country 6 months from now, a year from now, 5 years from now. And since we don't have that strategic thinking, analysis, and planning capacity, we tend to be late and ill-prepared when new events occur. And therefore, it's important to realize that having scientific knowledge, having a structured advisory role for policymaking is important, but there's a mediating element, it is as important than that. And that is the capacity of translate our scientific counseling in terms of a proposed strategy that can be discussed politically and decided in a way that becomes policy. Those are usually the key elements that need to be the mediating element between scientific advice and a proposed strategy that can become policy. So what we are saying is that these elements are essential to take from our community experience the elements necessary to provide a framework that goes beyond the obstacles of change. Let me summarize this in a final way. Well, we saw already what are the key elements that make change more difficult. And we saw that in order to counteract that, we need to use a different paradigm than the one that is associated with these obstacles for change. Let me summarize that very quickly for you. Of course, first, we need local action. And we need local action in a way that can be expanded and can provide actual learning that can be disseminated. And that means that this has to be coupled with ability of science to progress understanding on the basis of local action and translate that in scientific advice. And then from there, we have not only the ability to translate scientific advice in our strategy and policies, but also at the same time, in parallel with this government line, this governance line, we need to do social marketing about what we know so we can make sure that reinforce local action. And of course, then we do have policies that not only understand what's going on locally, but actually promote intelligent communities. And then on, this will take again for more knowledge, and we go on in this paradigm of change. And I think conclusion has to be something like, of course, if we do that, we can learn from the pandemic experience now. And in a way, we can say that we can return to the future, not to the past, but we can return to the future. And the alternatives, of course, is lose this opportunity for change again and don't benefit after all this personal community sacrifices of the pandemic we experience now. And I would like to end this short presentation with a basic idea is that our challenge is how to communicate such a story in a way that becomes part of everybody else's story. This is, in fact, in a few words, the key challenge of taking advantage of what we can learn from this pandemic. And thank you very much, and Merry Christmas. Καλά Χριστούγεννα για όλους σας.
Thank you, Professor Sakellarides, for this very, very interesting presentation. I was quite impressed with some of the things you presented. I would like to start basically with a question. So you essentially classified, let's say, the potential responses to the pandemic into this public health emergency dimension and the smart community dimension. And I was wondering first if the development, let's say, of the smart community dimension is a long-term investment, so that it requires long time to materialize. And the second one is, what are the underlying preconditions for building the capacity for this smart community? I mean, is this the investment to quality of governance, to social capital, to institutional trust? What are the preconditions for building this?
Well, it is not as complex as it seems sometimes. For example, give you a practical example to give you an answer. Now everybody is worried about Christmas. Can we plan Christmas in a way that we see our friends and our family enjoy this good feelings of family belonging, at the same time protect ourselves from the threat of the pandemic? Now, one tendency to say, okay, those are the norms that you have to follow to have a happy and safe Christmas. That is one approach. The second approach, you say, okay, I know that there are thousands of Greeks and Portuguese that are now planning the Christmas. And I can tell you my plan. You know, I have 3 daughters, so I have 3 events, 6 persons each event. There are 2 bubbles, my bubble and the visiting bubble, not more. We meet in a hall that is comfortable in terms of distancing. We use masks when we not travel around. We have the air conditioning connected and open the windows to ensure quiet ventilation. It will not take more than 2 hours and a half. So this is my plan. But I would like to know yours. Can your plan teach me something that I haven't thought about it? Can we share our plans for Christmas among the 1,000 Greeks and Portuguese that are planning the Christmas, and what we can learn from that? Can we take 12 prototypes of plans for Christmas for the community and discuss them and learn from that? That is feasible. It's much more intelligent. It promotes people to think about what they can do. Of course, we have to provide them information for that. Now, all our television's newscasts start with national data. They are meaningless. They don't mean anything. They are just accumulation of data about the country that do not say anything about it. Now, instead of doing that, if I get data about the incidence and type of transmission in my community, what percentage of positive tests there are, how my center is responding, if I get this sort of data about the local community, then I can plan my life. I can be more intelligent planning my life. So if I provide local data to people and stimulate them to configure and plan their life, whether it's Christmas, work, study, whatever, then I create a stimulus for social action and social memory. It's not that difficult. But our governance paradigms believe on vertical bureaucracies. Our television is conservative, and our social media tear us apart. And therefore, we need to have an alliance between community activation and science. So can use science as something can be powerful enough to create into government a sense of strategy. And that we did not discuss science in government, discuss strategies that are based on sciences. So those are the elements that I was saying. Can we tell this story in a way that produces change? It's not a matter of knowing about it. It's how you communicated about it. In our scientific meetings, in our television opportunities, in the articles in the newspaper, in the papers we write in the scientific press. And we are not doing enough of that. We as technical people and we as academics.
It looks like an approach slightly based on behavioral sciences. So you try to change behavior, making some things more visible. So there's a question from Professor Sakellarides, I can see. I don't know if you can see that question, otherwise I can read it. So it says, after welcoming my friend and colleague Constantino Sakellarides, my question is, would you consider the mobilization of various citizen social bodies, such as municipal authorities, religious bodies, athletic clubs, cultural societies, etc., as a way to develop a bottom-up approach?
Sure. My best regard to Tassos. I haven't seen him for some time. It's nice to see him well and asking interesting questions as usual. And of course, when we speak about community activation, we speak of community organizations. We don't need to invent new organizations all the time. There are enough organizations there. The question is that they don't get the critical information in time. We continue to use national information and discuss on the basis of national information. We need to get this local information to these social organizations so they interact with each other, and we can in a way develop our local plans, whether there are community action plans or whether there are individual ones or family ones. So in a way, activating is transforming knowledge in action with clear objectives that can be monitored and evaluated. We are not talking about poetry here. We are talking about whether by activating communities, we promote change. And that's why we need an alliance between science and academics and communities, so we can make sure that we can grasp which sort of interventions actually promote good results, real change, and what cannot do that. So it's not a matter of activating communities, all the organization task refers very well, but also making sure that we have the learning apparatus that we learn from that. And only by learning from that, we can force strategies and have this approach become an important element of policy of change in our nations.
Okay, great. I don't know, I can see there is no other question. So, because I can see the time is up as well. So I would like to thank you very much for this presentation. At least for me, it was a very interesting perspective. I have never heard of something like similar. I'm not a public health, let's say, expert, so it was very interesting for me. I would like to thank you very much for your participation, and looking forward to see you in the next Congress, I guess.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Hopefully in person.
Καλά Χριστούγεννα.
Καλά Χριστούγεννα. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.